axis in as far as understanding history is concerned, because we believe that that is important for us. And you are all welcome, colleagues. And I can see also the editor for the journal, Dr. Kirili, is also on board. And then today, colleagues, we are hosting Dr. Ali Hlongwane, who is going to take us through a very important topic and a theme with regards to the historiography of the liberation movement called the Pan Africanist Congress of Azania. And the title of the paper is Pan Africanist Letters, the Historical Development of Political Thought in the PAC of Azania, 1959 to 1993. And colleagues, let me take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Ali Hlongwane, who is a researcher in the history workshop at the University of the Witwatersrand. He has published on the public histories of the 1976 uprising, The Road to Democracy in South Africa, Volume 7, Soweto Uprising, New Perspectives, Commemoration and Memorialization, published in 2017. Dr. Hlongwane is the co-author of Public History and Culture in South Africa, Memorialization and Liberation Heritage Sites in Johannesburg and the Township Space, published in 2019. His recent publication is The Lion of Azania, a biography of Zephaniah Lekwame Motopeng, 1913 to 1990. And currently, Dr. Hlongwane is completing a biography on one of the leaders of the PAC also, John Nyati Pogela, 1921 to 1985. Dr. Ali, I'm also having your manuscript with me on the latest publication, and I will get some feedback soon. Over to you, Dr. Ali, and then you are welcomed. We are looking forward to hearing what you are saying. You've got 20 minutes to 25 minutes for the presentation, and then I'll just come in as a discussant, and thereafter we open up for questions. Over to you, Dr. Hlongwane. Thank you. I hope you don't mind if I switch my camera then.
No, I don't mind, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Twala. Let me take this opportunity to thank the two hosting organizations, the department, the history department, as well as the Southern Journal for Contemporary History, for affording me this opportunity to speak to you today on the topic that the program director has already read out. The Africanist Letters, the historical development of political thought in the PAC of Azania, 1959 to 1993. I stopped the talk in 1993. That does not mean the end of the PAC's struggle to develop ideas about the future of a country they call Azania. But in spite of the political challenges that the organization has faced, it has developed some policy perspectives that should be a subject for a different day. For today's work, which is a work in progress, excuse me, I am asking a number of interrelated questions. And the questions I'm exploring are, is there a tradition of Africanist thought intrinsically linked to the birth of the PAC as a liberation movement in South Africa? What are the lineages of the PAC's intellectual traditions? Given the PAC's short history as a legal political formation before it was banned in 1960, Is there a tradition of ideas to reflect upon? What are the roots of these ideas? Firstly, as manifest in the framing of liberation movements of the wars of resistance against colonial conquest as intrinsically linked to new 20th century struggles for national liberation. Secondly, how did these ideas manifest in the anti-colonial struggles' further development and transmutation into early freedom struggles as articulated by the emergent African intelligentsia, particularly after the Second World War? Thirdly, what was the influence on the PAC by other African independence struggles, particularly the independence of Ghana in 1957? And fourthly, is there a tradition of Africanist thought in these anti-colonial struggles, global connections, and the intricacies and challenges posed by the exile experiences of the PAC from 1960 to 1993? Before I delve into the histories of the PAC itself, I think it would suffice that one just give a short reflection on the ideas around intellectual history and intellectual traditions and the role of ideas in liberation struggles. I draw from various scholars, Anthony Box, that I want to start with, who writes on Pan-Africanist thought in the Caribbean context, makes the following observation. In the dialectic of history, as capitalism colonized many parts of the globe, those who are colonized developed a trajectory of struggle of their own, influenced by external political ideas, but rooted in the specificity of their colonial oppression. I therefore surmise that in South Africa, the Africanist intellectual tradition is one of many streams within the complex movement that engaged in the liberation struggle against apartheid colonialism. Other scholars too have reflected on the emergence and the significance of ideas in the liberation struggle. And Professor Njabulo Ndebele in particular articulates a view that no people, I quote, that has not set in motion its vast powers of reflection will have any systematic control whatsoever on its destiny. Ndebele's assertion is supported by Christine Kunta, who has also written that physical resistance to colonialism has always had an intellectual base in South Africa, allowing those involved in the struggle to create a framework for this very struggle. In this context, what then is this framework? Kwame Nkrumah, on the other hand, points out that there are four inevitable results of imperialism in the development of Africanist intellectual thought. And he says these represent the emergence of a colonial intelligentsia, the awakening of national consciousness amongst the colonized people, the emergence of a working class movement, and the growth of a national liberation movement. Africanist thought, therefore, was not an exception to the contextual thread outlined by Nkrumah. Developed and articulated by PAC activists and intellectuals, it represents a body of ideas that was shaped by consistent processes of reading, debate, critical analysis, writing, and practical struggles. Further, like all bodies of political thought, Africanist political thinking did not develop in a linear fashion. It borrowed, synthesized, and also discarded what was not useful in the corpus of ideas that were part of the resistance movement against the South African settler colonial state, the broader Pan-African movement in Africa, the African diaspora, as well as the world international struggle. Confusion, contradicting perspectives, and in some instances, deviation from the accepted, and I'm using accepted in inverted commas, political thinking, is itself an integral part of the history and development of political ideas of all liberation movements. And of course, I'm hoping in this article to demonstrate that the PAC is no exception in contradictory perspectives. I want to jump a little bit on the theoretical assumptions so that I don't lose a lot of time, but there are two scholars that I also want to reflect on. One is Ngugi, who argues that the dominant nation or class throws out its intellectual force, either from amongst its own or other ranks, which explain the world from the material basis and objective needs of the struggle of that class or nation. Such intellectuals assume the standpoint of the oppressed and exploited. Herbert Itumeleng Musala, who comes from the Black consciousness movement tradition, also notes that intellectuals engage in fierce struggles to conquer ideologically at the same time as they give birth to their own. So it was with the political thought of the PAC, the militant African nationalism that arguably can be traced from previous traditions of Ethiopianism, Gaveism, Pan Africanism, and other international trends such as Caribbean nationalism and the effects of the 1945 Pan-African Congress. The key features characterizing the activism of the PAC intellectuals, in my view, is characteristic of organic intellectuals, and of course can again be described in the words of Musala as their rootedness in their community, their class origins notwithstanding, that they have undergone a certain process of theoretical reflection, either formally or informally. They are socially recognized to have attained certain specializations and level of knowledge in a way in which they could be relied upon to illuminate certain realities. They are not simply certified people, they are recognizable, knowledgeable people. They are not socially and politically neutral intellectuals. On the contrary, their roots in the community are a function of their political commitment to the interests and aspirations of the community. What then defined these intellectuals is that they assimilated foreign ideas, but they were of the view that the assimilation of foreign ideas by a particular culture must be preceded by the naturalization of those ideas by intellectuals of that particular group or community through the medium of culture and traditions of that particular class, community, or society. I then want to trace three areas that represent the development of PAC ideas. First, it is well known that the PAC broke away from the ANC, though it always argues that it is not a breakaway movement. It is the original ANC, and that is debatable. I'm not asserting that point of view myself. But the point I want to make is that the PAC, when it was founded, embraced the early ideas of the founding members of the ANC from 1912 and only distanced itself from the advent of the Congress Alliance as well as the adoption of the Freedom Charter. However, the core of the organization's roots are rooted in the Youth League. And there are two figures in the Youth League that are of great significance to the PAC. And those are Anton Muzwake Lembede, as well as A.P. Mda. Of course, we are privileged now, post-1994, that two scholars, Robert Edgar and Msumza, have collected the works of A.P. Mda under the title Africa's Cause Must Triumph, as well as the ideas of Anton Lembede under the title Freedom in Our Lifetime. Both Lembede and A.P. Mda coined somehow the concept Africanism. However, they do not seem to have borrowed ideas from the Pan-African movement in the continent and globally in their ideas. That responsibility fell on Sobukwe in particular and other founding members of the PAC like Peter Mulutsi, like Peter Raburoko, who sharpened the ideas. And their ideas emerged through a publication initially called The Africanist. And the key themes that emerge from the Africanists is an attempt to interpret the wars of resistance as an integral part of struggles for liberation. Of course, in that context, in framing the wars of resistance as an integral part of the struggle for liberation, the authors in the Africanist do not acknowledge that the wars of resistance were waged at small community or micro community level. And therefore, the kind of nationalism or nationalist perspective that emerged later is not easily transmuted from the wars of nationalism to the new ideas, particularly after the Second World War. But Sobukwe himself and his team, of course, drew a lot, particularly from George Patmore and Kwame Nkrumah. To some extent, they cite Marcus Garvey, and they coined or embraced the concept Pan-Africanism. And Sobukwe himself argued that they, as founders of the PAC, were rejecting South African exceptionalism and saw themselves as linked to the broader struggle in the continent and also globally amongst people of Africa. Another key figure and intellectual who shapes the thinking in the PAC is George Patmore. And he shapes the PAC thinking in two ways. First, before I even mention the two ways in which he shapes the PAC, is that both Sobukwe, Peter Raburoko, and Peter Mulutsi acknowledge that the book by George Patmore, Pan-Africanism or Socialism, was literally like their Bible. The only copy or the few copies they had were circulated amongst the broader intellectual core of the organization, and they drew a lot from them. The influence of George Patmore is the PAC's distancing itself from the Soviet Union. Of course, this has become a controversial aspect of the PAC. Many others argue that the PAC was therefore anti-communist and anti-socialist. Yet there is hardly a single policy document from the ranks of the PAC that says the PAC distances itself from socialism or even communism. In fact, what emerges from the PAC literature is that the PAC had reservations with the South African Communist Party, or the Communist Party of South Africa as it was called then, particularly when it came to their attitude to the question of the native republic. Furthermore, from George Patmore was part of the Communist International. He then was actually resigned from the Communist International when Stalin took a decision to collaborate with the West in the name of fighting fascism. And George Patmore's argument was the very government that Stalin was now forging an alliance with, supposedly against fascism, were the colonialists in Africa and in the Caribbean. And he saw a contradiction there. And it is this contradiction that was embraced by the founders of the PAC, and it emerges in the writings of Sobukwe in particular. Kwame Nkrumah, too, was a major source of influence in the ideas that evolved in the PAC. In fact, when the organization was launched, there were letters of support that came from the Bureau of African Nationalism that was based in Cairo. And shortly after the PAC was banned, a number of PAC activists, including Peter Aburoko, who left the country earlier, just before 1960, became part of the Bureau of African Nationalism and contributed articles in the Black Review, which was published by the Bureau of African Nationalism. The banning of the PAC represents another dimension in the development of PAC ideas. Whilst the PAC had claimed or made a pronouncement that it is neutral in the East-West conflict, the realities of the politics and practice of exile was that it needed resources, it needed friends. And one of the areas it looked into was communist China. And key figures from the PAC, including Templeton Dantala, including Peter Aburoko, got their military training in China, and on their return into the ranks of the PAC, began to introduce the new ideas that they had assimilated, the notion of Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. And the PAC then produced a document called The New Road of Revolution. There are, of course, contestations within the PAC. There is a pull back to Pan Africanism and African nationalism, and those who represented that pull back did not embrace the new road of revolution. They saw the new road of revolution as a deviation from the nationalist perspective, because the new road of revolution introduced class analysis. And I argue in my study of the PAC ideas that though the founders of the PAC were conscious of class differentiations amongst the oppressed, they shied away from developing a clear class perspective and a clear embrace of a class line of struggle. They instead chose to make a distinction between what they called national groups that were people of European ancestry, that they saw as foreigners, people of Indian ancestry, that they saw as people who did not come into the country as the conquerors, but were dehumanized with the country and the soil when they were brought in as indentured laborers. And on the question of people who define themselves, or the system defined as so-called colored, the PAC's view was that they are Africans, and it rejected the concept colored. And instead of pursuing a class line, the PAC and Sobukwe pursued a line that said Africans are the most oppressed, and therefore they are the core and cornerstone of the liberation struggle. with hindsight, of course, this is an area that requires even more problematization and a better critical reflection of opportunities that the PAC missed from taking a clear class perspective, because the failure to take a clear class perspective is partly accountable for the neo-colonial situation we find ourselves in post-1994. Apart from the fact that a lot of opportunities were missed as a result of unnecessary infighting within the liberation movement and the heavy reliance on solidarity group in terms of funding the liberation movement as opposed to basing it internally in the country. Then another significant development happens around the 1980s with the release of John Nyati Pokela from prison, who then had to go back and save the PAC from tearing itself into literally pieces and becoming dysfunctional. And in his attempt to regroup the PAC, Nyati Pokela at no stage does he refer to the new road of revolution. In fact, the interviews I've had with people who met him when they were already in exile, particularly the class of 76, they say when he arrived in exile, he found them talking Marx, talking Lenin, talking Mao Zedong, and he returned them back to Apim Da, to Anton Lembede, to thinking around Pan Africanism. And in the literature of the PAC from 1980 until its unbanning in 1999, the new road of revolution is no longer referred to. Class struggle does not emerge again from the organization. And there is still an insistence, in spite and despite of the political economy of South Africa, on saying people must be rallied under the banner of nationalism. This is again an area of critical reflection that I will be going deeper into, because what it means is that it was a failure to read a country that was industrialized, a country that had developed a massive trade union movement, irrespective of the different ideological directions the trade union movement took. But there was a clear mobilizations around class and worker issues. And yet the PAC somehow was still insistent on African nationalism as a rallying point. And this creates a discord with the youth wing of the PAC, the Azanian National Youth Unity, which was established in 1983. In the few publications, speeches of their members, notes of their political education workshops, they again go and draw back from the road of revolution. They draw from the thinking and the ideas of Edwin Makoti, who played a critical role in the writing of the new road of development. They also draw from the teachings of the Tanzanian activist Ali Babu, whose popular book amongst the ranks of the youth was African Socialism or Socialist Africa. And Babu's argument was that there was no African socialism, there was no European socialism, but socialism was proletarian. That was Babu's ideas. Of course, then the question is, which ideas took an upper hand as the PAC moved towards 1990 to begin to engage in the struggle for negotiations, which itself was contested heavily within the movement. And those, of course, would emerge in the policy documents that the organization released as there was a build-up to 1994, and those are not a subject of my discussion today. So therefore, I would like to then say, to fold my talk at this, that although the PAC saw the South African struggle as an integral part of the broader African revolution, it did not problematize the emergent neo-colonial order as inimical to that African revolution. The reasons here may have been largely a strategic and tactical imperative. The South African liberation struggle relied on the solidarity of African states. Military bases for the prosecution of armed struggle were largely on the soil of several African countries. Also, a reckless attack on those states that took a neo-colonial route may have driven them closer or into overt alliances with the South African settler colonial state. Therefore, the PAC was not ready to embrace Nkrumah's critical warnings about neo-colonialism, to prepare theoretically for the setbacks of the 1980s. An added defect for the PAC was the incessant infighting that I have mentioned earlier. In the midst of debilitating intra-party conflict, there is no space to sum up experiences systematically and to prepare for oncoming political developments. Thus, in the post-1994 period, the PAC has been overshadowed by its past, and it is failing to redefine itself and redesign its political trajectory. The origins of the neo-colonialist political developments came in the 1980s with the collapse of the Stalinist regimes in Eastern Europe. The collapse of the Stalinist regimes was followed by the retreat or defeatist approach of radical and socialist ideas in the public discourse. In Africa, Mozambique and Angola, countries that had taken the Moscow line of socialist development, were dragged into civil wars and forced to look up to the sponsors of those civil wars for aid in exchange for dumping their chosen path of development. The African states that took the neo-colonial route from the outset degenerated. Kenyan activist Ngugi wa Thiong'o has observed that they have marred class consciousness and rekindled the ethnic feelings and differences negatively rather than positively. They have exploited the cultural diversity of Africa for their own personal political survival at the expense of continental integrity and pride of our languages and other ethnic richnesses, which would benefit all irrespective of one's origin. They have succeeded in cloaking all this in the name of multi-party democracy. Just as it was during the anti-colonial and anti-apartheid periods in South Africa, the spectra of Africanist thinking and the ideology of Pan Africanism is as evident as it was before. In its manifestation, the Africanist thought and ideology of Pan Africanism one day will be in direct confrontation with the texts of neo-colonialism. Sobukwe's political thought emerges there and there among students, amongst new biographies. There are some who attempt to link it to the union, to the foundation of the African Union. But I argue that that view needs to be problematized. Is the African Union a Pan-Africanism of the ordinary people from the ground, or is the African Union a Pan-Africanism of the leaders, a platform to defend themselves against ordinary people across the colonial borders? Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hlongwane. Very important elucidation in that regard. And I'll just hand over to my colleague Laszlo, just to give a guidance and open up for questions. Thank you. Over to you, Laszlo. You are muted, Laszlo.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much for taking over the chairing in the beginning of this seminar series. I was experiencing some connectivity issues, and I apologize for that. I would like to also thank Dr. Hlongwane for your engaging and well-researched and presented paper. I think in a very clear and concise manner, you really provided a fascinating overview of the intellectual development of the PAC's ideological tradition and untangled some of the complexities that it struggled with as a liberation movement. So we'll now move on to about 10 minutes of discussion of the paper by Professor Twala, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So without further ado, Professor Twala, it's up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pasame. Thank you, Dr. Ali, for this informative kind of a paper. It is also important that we need not to relegate the history of the PAC to the periphery in terms of our liberation historiography. And it is incumbent upon us that when the story or the history of the liberation movements is told or written, that the PAC should also be accorded that space, as you attempted to do in your paper, Dr. Adi, and that is commendable. It is also important to note that when the PAC was formed in 1959 in April, and then it only survived for 12 months before it was banned. But through your paper, we can deduce that although it was 12 months old before its banning, and it survived to influence people intellectually through other means. And hence today, we are talking about the tradition of the Africanist thought within the PAC. And then you managed to bring all together the intellectuals within the PAC in trying to give us that voice of the intellectual thought. In your paper, you also highlighted the influence of the 1945 Pan Africanist Congress in Manchester and the 1958 Congress in Ghana, and how that also rekindled the ideas of the leaders of the PAC in taking the PAC's ideology forward. And what is also important is that you are linking Ethiopianism, Ghanaianism with Pan-Africanism in a broader context, and as to how that also sharpened the minds of the leaders of the PAC. And it is also important, and reading from your paper, that there was also a contestation for political ideas within the leaders of the PAC. You made mention of people like Peter Molotsi, Peter Raburoko, and you made mention of people like Raburoko versus the Ntantala issue, and which is also important, and most of the liberation historians are shying away from unpacking that discourse and that debate and putting it to the fore as to was the whole question of the fallout between the two leaders, Ntantala and Raburoko, based on the question of the influence of China, or it was more than that, or it was more of the contestation for political space within the PAC itself. And that needs to be unpacked also. And also the influence of Ghana, you touched on the influence of Ghana and the influence of Tanzania in the whole history of the PAC as sanctuary countries for the PAC. And then one would also want to know as to what impact did the PAC have on the leader of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, because at some point Julius Nyerere was in favor of the PAC in Tanzania at the expense of the ANC. What is that that was appealing to the Tanzanian leader from the PAC's side? And what is that Tanzania also imparted to the PAC leaders? We also need to track, I think, Dr. Ali, in terms of tracking these ideas and the intellectual influences, we track the places en route to exile as to how these different countries, starting from Lesotho, going up to Botswana, infiltrating up to the north, how those places which were so-called pro-Pan Africanist influenced these leaders of the PAC in rekindling their ideas in as far as Pan Africanism was concerned. And then one cannot write about the PAC and forget to write something about Ntsumukeke in Lesotho and the impact Ntsumukeke also had on the leaders of the PAC. It is also important that we also need to track, perhaps in one of the biographies or studies, that to track Nkuchewu Peter Raburoko's role within the PAC. And by his own admission, Nelson Mandela said Raburoko was one of the best intellectuals to have been produced by the PAC. And perhaps we need also to unpack that as historians. You made mention of the PAC intellectuals being assimilated by foreign ideas, within foreign ideas, and then how these foreign ideas were exposed through the dealings and the publications, as well as the speeches that were delivered by PAC members, whether before the unbanning and after the unbanning. And that will also be of interest to us as liberation historians. And lastly, perhaps, it is also important, Dr. Ali, to take the period after 1994, perhaps after 1990, and look at some of the white people who became members of the PAC. Was it a conscious decision from those white members, or were they influenced by the political, intellectual Africanist thought from the PAC leaders that they became members of the PAC? People like Patrick Duncan, and there was a certain, I think it was Costas Gazi, who also became the member of the PAC. And for now, Dr. Laszlo, I'll just put a comma and not a full stop there. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Twala. I really appreciate that. So we will open up the floor to questions. I will take 3 questions in a group and present them to Dr. Shongwane. So does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? You can either type them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them directly. Anybody have any questions? If not, then I will start off. Yes. All right.
Sorry. Hello. This is Matteo Grilli. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can hear you, Matteo.
So my question for the presenter is, first of all, thank you very much for your paper. I just wanted to know a little more, if you can elaborate a little more on how, in the phase where socialism was in fact included in the program, let's say, of the PAC, if there was some original thinking of how socialism would have to be, included in the new South Africa, which would emerge out of the liberation. So how concretely the PAC wanted to interpret socialism within the new system they wanted to create. So that's Great.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Are there any other questions from the floor? No questions. All right. Dr. Shlongwane, do you want to answer some of the questions raised by Professor Twala and Dr. Grilli?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Prof. Twala, and also thank you, Dr. Matteo, for the question as well as the comments. I think Dr. Twala's observations are very important, and they identify the gaps that one needs to explore. One of those gaps, of course, he says it's around the debates between the Ntantala group and the Raburoko group, whether those debates were genuinely ideological or they were a fight to control the organization given the challenges of operating in exile, or there were contestation and debates to find space within the PAC. And I think those 3 points play themselves out. Ntantala wrote a number of pieces where he was articulating the direction that the PAC needed to take ideologically and militarily. But also people like Raburoko, who had already been expelled by PK Libalo from the organization, were struggling to assert their right to be back in the ranks of the PAC. And in the process of those struggles and contestation, at times, ideological issues became sidelines, and the struggle became largely a struggle of personalities. Nonetheless, it is worth it to explore, as Prof. Twala identifies, the space or the place of those ideas in terms of how they shaped PAC or failed to shape PAC thinking. He raised an important point about the relationship between the PAC and Nyerere of Tanzania. Of course, if you read the biography of Mandela, The Road to Freedom, he acknowledges the struggles that the ANC had when they first arrived in exile, because the PAC had sent earlier Peter Raburoko and Peter Mlutsi and Nana Mahomo to interact with the new emergent leaders of the PAC. But Nkrumah in particular, as I indicated, had already been communicating with the PAC long before it was banned. Some historians even suggest that the character of the PAC's positive action campaign was shaped by Nkrumah, but the name of the campaign itself is similar to the name of the campaign of positive action that Nkrumah launched to get independence for Ghana in the late 50s. But the other role that Nyerere played was to refuse the idea that emerged from the Asian conference that said there were 8 or so only representatives of the oppressed in the then Southern Africa, and that was Frelimo, it was MPLA, in Namibia it was SWAPO, and then in Guinea-Bissau it was the party of Amilcar Cabral. And that process, of course, pushed out SWANU in Namibia and excluded the PAC in the South African context. And Nyerere did not accept that. He continued to defend the right of the PAC to exist as an organization. He also defended the PAC in spite of its problems and challenges from being de-recognized by the OAU. And there were pressures, particularly from the ANC, to push for the derecognition of the ANC by both the OAU and the United Nations, where it sat as an observer. So that was the role that Nyerere played in particular, uniting the organization, even intervening militarily in the camps when there were indications that the arms were going to be used by cadres against each other. And he sent the Tanzanian Defense Force to disarm them, but also the Tanzanian Defense Force trained and reoriented many PAC cadres back into the PAC when especially the Azanian People's Liberation Army was being established. I note the gap around Nsu Mukhehle, and it is true, Mukhehle's association with the PAC begins at Fort Hare, because he was at Fort Hare around the time when Sobukwe, Pokela, Mugabe were students at Fort Hare. And he was part of the Youth League too. And then when the BPC was formed, it had a very close relationship with the PAC. In fact, some members of the PAC, like Libalo, Zef Mutuping, seem to have had dual membership, as members of the PAC and members of the BPC. And Zef Mutuping, whom is a subject of one of my biographies, actually worked closely with Mukhehle when it was called, the country was still called Basutoland, where they were teachers, but they were also producers of a newspaper called Muhlabani. And they contributed articles there, and they were both banned from the teaching profession. And in some way, they became some kind of full-time activists, with Mukhehle focusing on the BPC, Mutuping coming back to the country and being in and out of prison. Whilst the PAC, if you shies away from describing people, in fact, Khoisan X said, we do not describe people, we define who is an African. But indeed, people who were described or defined as white joined the PAC right from the 1960s. And Costa Kazi joined the PAC in exile, not post-94. There were many others who were part of the PAC, but their numbers wouldn't be as visible and dominant as, for instance, if you were to do comparisons between the ANC and the PAC. And then, of course, important work needs to be done to understand those who got attracted to the PAC post-1994, what attracted them to the organization. I think work needs to be done on that. I agree that the period after 1994 does deserve a bit of attention. I'm leaving it in this current study because I think it deserves a more in-depth investigation than it would permit if it is included in the current study. Then the question by Dr. Mateu about socialism. I would argue that the PAC's views of socialism did not go beyond sloganeering. When the PAC was formed in 1959, it said it stands for an Africanist socialist democracy, recognizing the spiritual interest of an individual. And they said it is Africanist because, in their view, socialism should be Africanist or African in content and in scope, but they did not necessarily mean African socialism as it was subsequently developed by Nyerere in particular. In fact, the there are different schools of thought within the PAC. There are individuals who wrote about African socialism. There are individuals within the PAC who critiqued the notion of African socialism, particularly the idea that socialism is inherently inborn, that equating the concept of Ubuntu to socialism, or equating a pre-industrialized society and claiming it was communalist. That emerges also even in the early works of Anton Lembede. Those were very problematic views, and in the New Road of Revolution in particular, those are critiqued as unscientific. In fact, PAC even goes to an extent of critiquing negritude. And it is found in the writings of David Spergo in particular, who spent a lot of time in the US as a representative of the PAC, as an observer in the United Nations, and he interacted with organizations like the Black Panther, the All African People's Revolutionary Party of Kwame Ture. And the idea, and it probably explains also the minor differences that emerged between the PAC and the Black consciousness movement in this country. Many people usually say they don't understand why the PAC and the Black consciousness movement did not just somehow automatically, unite or form an alliance. There were subtle differences of interpretation of what constitutes both the national and social question. And as I said, that the PAC, though it has over the years been accused of being racist, the PAC actually shied away from defining people according to color, and it was very conscious from an early stage of a biological interpretation of struggle. So without deviating too much from the question, really the core of my answer is that the PAC did not develop socialism beyond the slogans, but also the liberation movements themselves tended to shy away from saying what is going to be the content of the new society. They focused on getting rid of the oppression in the way they understood oppression, and shied away from saying the new society that will emerge will take this particular direction. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those very engaging answers to those questions. A quick question by Herbert Seedladen Thuli. Please ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Do you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yes,
go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much, Dr. Hlongwane, as well as Prof. Twala. I really enjoyed your presentation. But I have one simple question or short question here. The PAC was formed by people who were not happy about the Freedom Charter, in particular because of certain clauses in the Charter. But surprisingly, the very same people in exile were influenced by foreign ideas which had nothing to do with Pan Africanism. And that led to contestation, as you correctly said, amongst the leaders. How did that happen? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will ask one short question, and then I think we have to close it. So in this greater Pan-Africanist and Africanist intellectual tradition that you have charted, was there a unique characteristic about the Pan-Africanist Congress intellectual tradition that set itself apart from other movements? So the Pan-Africanist Congress aligned itself with Africanist ideas and ideologies and Pan-Africanism as an ideology. But was there something that was unique to the PAC in the way in which they interpreted it, these ideologies? As you say, I think ideas had to be nativized in your presentation. So what are some of these ways in which the PAC adopted these big intellectual traditions and made it their own, unique to South Africa and the party. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. On the first question, first, the idea that there are ideas that are foreign is itself a problem. I do not subscribe to that view myself, that they were foreign ideas. First of all, the founders of the PAC were products of missionary education. So they had embraced some form of liberalism. At the time, they were students at Fort Hare, and even earlier, some of them were students at St. Peter's, which was an Anglican school. They were in the teaching profession. When they were at Fort Hare, of course, they were influenced by the teachings of Azikiwe, Nandi Azikiwe, because they subscribed to that journal or the newspapers he was publishing at the time, the late 40s, early 50s. Some of them were of the Christian faith. For instance, Sobukwe was also a lay preacher in the Methodist Church. Zef Mutuping was a choir conductor in the Anglican Church. So they were syncretic in their ideas. The arguments, of course, around their parting ways with the ANC was around the issues of leadership, whether they argued with hindsight, but the major argument that comes is that they were opposed to the ethnic compartmentalization of the alliance. Remember, the alliance was constituted of the Indian Congress, of the Colored People's Congress, of the Congress of Democrats, where people were then defined according to so-called color, or I don't want to use the word race because then it assumes there are many races, and I also subscribe to the view that there's actually one race, the human race. So they were opposed to that, but within the politics of the Congress alliance, they were unhappy with the role of numbers, that whilst the ANC had the majority, but in the committee of the Congress alliance, it was on equal or on same terms with organizations that made, like Congress of Democrats, that probably did not have more than 100 followers, and the Indian Congress too, that had a small constituency. Then it comes to the Freedom Charter itself. Before debating the content of the Freedom Charter, they also had reservations around who wrote the Freedom Charter. And that question has actually been answered today. If you read Ben Turok and others in their biographies, they actually claim triumphantly which phrases of the Freedom Charter were written by them from beginning to end. Ben Turok says, I solely wrote the clause on the economy. So the PAC was saying, but what then is the right of self-determination if one section of the community becomes the thinker on behalf of the majority? And their idea of the majority was the African majority. Yeah, there are clauses in the Freedom Charter, particularly that one around the land belongs to all who lived in it. Yes, they made a big issue out of that one. I hope I have answered the question that the issue of indigeneity was always problematized, but ideas were borrowed from across, and the PAC did not borrow new ideas only after the exile period. If you read Sobukwe, for instance, he read many of the English authors, whether they were playwrights or novelists. They studied socialism, Lenin, Marx, so that they can debate with confidence with those who were in the Communist Party. And when you engage in that type of intellectual work, you will be, you assimilate some ideas, you reject others. So Pan-Africanism itself, comes from the global experience of a people who were enslaved, and they borrowed ideas also from the Caribbean, African American, but also the core of the people who were in the 1945 Congress, Kamuzu Banda, Jomo, Kenyatta, and the others. What are the unique characteristics of the PAC's Pan-Africanism? That's an important question, and I would like to shy away from answering it at this stage. I would like to think deeper and revisit the literature that I am studying. But my sense is that it's not completely unique. It is purely an interplay of the emphasis of the notion of self-determination in terms of the liberation of the country, self-determination in that the oppressed need to develop ideas on their own and develop programs of action, but also the idea of the unity of the global Africa is also not new. They borrowed it from those who had even championed it long before. They probably become unique in the South African context, and it has become a debate in that they rejected South African exceptionalism. And South African exceptionalism is a problem today, post-1994, which is why we now even talk of so-called xenophobia. It's why a head of state could refer to a country like Malawi and say, we are not Malawi here. That is a reflection of a mentality that did not embrace the fact that the problems of South Africa will never be solved independent of the resolutions of problems in other parts of the continent, but also in terms of the global left. Thank you.
I think that's it for today. We will leave it there. Once again, thank you very much for your presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope that many of the members in the audience did too. And I look forward to seeing this paper being published. I think it's a very important contribution to the historiography on the PAC, as well as the broader liberation history of South Africa and the region. So thank you, and yeah, look forward to that.
Thank you too.
Do not forget to join us for our next seminar presentation by Dr. Kwashe Shitofire. We'll be talking about the illicit cannabis production by the communities of the Mokatlong district of Lesotho. So we will send out reminders for this upcoming presentation and hope to see you there soon. I wish everybody a pleasant Tuesday afternoon. Sorry, and yeah, keep well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye.